Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Tēnei te mihi atu kia koutou huri noa i te ao. Tēnei te mihi i te ata, i te ahiahi, i te pōrānei. Ko Waio, ko Ngāti Ranginui, Ngaitirangi, Raukawa me Ngāti Haua. Ko Emma Waimarie Rawson-Te Patu. Tōku ingoa. Good morning, good afternoon and good evening to you all around the planet today. Tuesday, the 7th of April, the second day of Global Public Health Week for the World Federation of Public Health Associations. It's a real pleasure to welcome you all here with us this morning here in Washington, D.C. for me, to join us on this, what we're calling the President's Fireside Chat. And we have some friends of ours with us this morning and afternoon or evening, depending on who you are and where you are. You will be familiar, I'm sure, with these people that are joining us today to speak on the subject of this week, Peace for Health and Health for Peace, with a particular Indigenous lens and a decolonising public health lens. So I would like to welcome our guests this morning, and I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves. And I will start with Mr. Adrian Te Patu, all the way in Kalgoorlie, Australia. Good morning.
Kia ora, Emma. Kia ora tātou tuaka ki te mihi atu kia koutou e huhi mai nei I tēnei rā, no reira o ka rangatira. Tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. Warm wishes here from Western Australia. It's lovely to be here in this fireside space, so thank you, Emma. Thank you as the President of the Federation, and thank you for launching the World Federation's contribution to Global Public Health Week. And of course, the topic is peace and health and peace. So I'm Adrian. I actually live in New Zealand. I'm over here in Australia for a wee while, and we'll be heading back sometime. It's my privilege to be one of the original chairs of the Indigenous Working Group of the World Federation of Public Health Associations. 10 years ago next month, it was my privilege to be a member of the Governing Council, the first recognised Indigenous person of the Federation in its 57 years, I think, at that stage. I also am a co-director for the Centre of Men's Health at the University of Otago in New Zealand. It's our oldest university, and also have a number of other roles as part of the Mental Health Foundation of New Zealand, and a few other governance roles in and around. I'm particularly a devotee of public health and Indigenous public health, so it's my privilege to be in and around the global platform for a while. So it's lovely to be here with you all. So hello and good evening here from Western Australia. It's 10 p.m.
Kia ora, Adrian. Thank you very much. And we'll go across to you, Jessica. Good morning.
Good morning. So nice to be here today. My name is Jessica Kronstadt. I'm the program director at the Planetary Health Alliance, which is a network of individuals and organizations throughout the globe that are all working to address that intersection of public health and environmental change. And it's really a pleasure for me to be here for several reasons. First of all, my whole profession has been around public health. And so I recently came to Planetary Health out of the realization that if we want to have a population in which all can be healthy, we can't do that without addressing those environmental harms. And so happy to be part of this global event, and very happy to be able to be here with colleagues and friends like Emma and Geoffrey, Adrian, and Alejandro today. I do just want to quickly note that throughout today's conversation, my opinions are my own and don't reflect any institution, but I'm very happy to be here with you all today.
Thank you, Jessica. And it's, as always, very lovely to have you with us. And across to you, Geoffrey.
Hello. Nice to see everybody. My name is Geoffrey Roth. I am Lakota Sioux from the Standing Rock Reservation, North Dakota, South Dakota. My family's mostly in North Dakota. I was raised in Portland in the urban Indian community in Portland, Oregon, but I live in Washington, D.C. and have for a number of years now, where I work with the urban Indian population here in Washington, D.C., with our organization, Capital Native Nations. I also am the chair of the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, which I'll talk a lot more about the Indigenous Determinants of Health today, which is a group that came together out of our UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues reports defining these determinants of health. I'm also a former member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. My term ended this past December. I spent 2 terms on that forum. And then in my work, where which pays the bills, as I work with tribes here in the United States and urban Indian organizations, specifically around health policy, Indian health services, Medicaid, Medicare, and advise other communities on how to get access to care for our Indigenous community. So, thanks.
Good morning, Geoffrey. Thank you. And Alejandro, I believe you are joining us from Mexico.
Yes. Hello, everyone. My name is Alejandro Bermudez. I am the coordinator for the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, and I am also the vice president for Cedar Rock Alliance, and I'm very happy to be here with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. And once again, thank you to all of you for joining me this morning, this afternoon, or this evening. It's always great to be in the presence of all of you. And I just also want to acknowledge Matthew Carvalho, who is running this session for us in the background. Matthew has been a significant support to a number of us on this call today in terms of a really great ally to help support the work that we are trying to achieve as Indigenous leaders globally. So thank you, Matthew. I also want to acknowledge that I've just seen Roger Nascimento is in the crowd who have joined us to listen in today. So it's nice to see you there, Roger. It's been a while. Really looking forward to, trying to, impart a few things, but share a few things with you all listening, really looking at the work that we've been doing at the World Federation in the past 4 years particularly. So I just want to recognise that I am still the current president of the World Federation of Public Health Associations, the first Indigenous woman to hold that role. And also now expert member of the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues. And that is centrally important to me also in this conversation today, because we are talking about health for peace and peace for health. One of the key goals for the World Federation is for peace and safety, the commitment to peace and safety, and also a commitment to systems change and decolonizing public health. I believe, and I think I can speak for all of my friends on this conversation today, that both of these things are central to how we need to transform the way in which not only public health is done, but how we look at how we really experience and make decisions and distribute power and resource around the world to make sure that everybody gets what they need, how they need it, when they need it, where they need it. And I guess no more than now are we experiencing, significant challenges to humankind in a way that we've never seen before. And so I'm going to go to Adrian first, and I'm going to invite him to talk us through a bit around why it was really important for the World Federation to have an Indigenous working group. And in that conversation to touch on, the different faces of indigeneity globally, in particular, when we're thinking about peace and safety and conflict, some of the things that some Indigenous populations experience more than others. Also maybe to touch on some of the reasons why Indigenous people are not acknowledged in the places where they are, and just a general sense of the importance of understanding indigeneity as central to the conversation around equity. So over to you, Adrian.
Thank you, Emma. Well, I'm going to just give global context, really. What I really appreciate about being in the presence of the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance and also Planetary Health Alliance is that what we have is we've got experts coming in. So if I just give, as Emma's alluded to, give us a kind of a snapshot of what indigeneity kind of looks like. So there are about 500 million people globally who self-identify and are recognised by the United Nations and the World Health Organization as being Indigenous. We span a number of places, a number of countries and jurisdictions. So being Indigenous means different things to different people. One of the questions we get asked a lot is, what is Indigenous? What does that kind of look like? As a general rule, we tend to use the World Health Organization's and WHO's definition of indigeneity. What I want to say is that as an Indigenous working group, we have three faces that we talk about. So one of them are those of us who exist in the global north. So of the 500 million people who identify, probably less than 45 million come from the global north, and that would be Aotearoa New Zealand, the Commonwealth of Australia, the United States and its territories, Canada, and then those, the Sami Nor, particularly in the Nordic countries, so particularly in Norway, Finland plus, and of course this also includes those in the Arctic Circle, which includes those in Greenland who are Inuit and the Danish nationals. So we represent a kind of small group compared to the major numbers. So by far, over 400 million people who are Indigenous actually come from the global south. Many of those people live in war zones. So I'll just give another broader sense of what the planet looks like. And I know we've all got a sense of what it looks like. So of the 8 billion plus humans on this planet, part of the reality is that 2 billion are living in war zones. And just to kind of, for those of you who kind of run with numbers, and it gives kind of framework in there. 1 in 6 humans as we speak live in the People's Republic of China. 1 in 6 people as we speak live in India, particularly, and on the Indian subcontinent. So I'm going to touch on something that Emma alluded to. About 45% of the people who identify as being Indigenous live in the 2 largest populated places on Earth. So 2/3 of humanity live in the People's Republic of China and India, kind of equal amounts. What's important in terms of this particular group of Indigenous folk is there are about 105 million people in the People's Republic of China who are Indigenous, who self-identify and also recognised by the WHO and the United Nations. They are not recognised for their indigeneity by the People's Republic of China for political reasons. So that's the business of the People's Republic of China. It doesn't mean that we obfuscate any responsibility about not acknowledging them and that they exist. About 105 million plus live in India. They are not recognised similarly in their jurisdiction for cultural and traditional reasons. So mainly to do with the caste system and other ways. So our numbers represent 2 particular faces. The working group also acknowledges another face of indigeneity. And we refer to those of us, there are some that are online at the moment, that are actually from countries who have their own sovereignty, but they've been profoundly influenced as colonies of what we now refer to as the global north, particularly Britain, France, and other colonizing countries. So they've had a profound influence through, so structurally they're designed in a kind of similar way, and they have got they belong to that space. So there we go, 500 million. Where we intersect really, when you get past the things, and we get asked a lot, because many of the Indigenous Working Group come from the global north, are we speaking on behalf of Indigenous people globally? And my response, and our response is a simple one. One of the places that we intersect as Indigenous people across the planet is that we live simply shorter, sicker lives than most of the people in our jurisdiction. And so that's the place that gives us a place of kind of supporting the sovereignty, whatever that looks like in the journey. And so that's that kind of broader sense. Another thing that I think is important is if we just acknowledge, I'm just going to pick on 3 significant humans in the last few years. If we look at the Secretary General of the United Nations and the Director General of the World Health Organization, and actually the previous Pope, one of the places that they intersect on their narrative is acknowledging the importance of leaning into the traditional and historical knowledge of Indigenous folk. Now, that's not just an opportunity to make statements in that space. It's very, very important that we kind of appreciate that. So I'm going to just pause and go to the side with regards to the topic that we're here for, which is really around peace and health and peace. So in a kind of an Indigenous lens, it embodies really a holistic and interconnected understanding of well-being, where peace is fundamental to health, and health in turn sustains peace. And that's really, really important, because if we say in health, the difference between public health and most other health is around the absence of disease. Well, for Indigenous people, peace is not merely the absence of conflict. So it's a state of balance, harmony, justice, and symbiotic relationships in the places that have given us sustenance for millennia. And so a lot of those situations and positions have been taken away as a result of colonisation. I'm not here to talk about all the things about colonisation. We can share war stories really, really well, and quite rightly so. So part of this thing about being pro-social in the space is that the Indigenous Working Group needs to be a place where we can also come together with allies such as the Planetary Health Alliance, and of course, this is Jessica and Geoffrey and Alejandro and the kind of work they're doing, and also the other with this, that's being done by Emma on a number of spaces. So our mandate is not to speak on behalf of everybody, but our mandate is to speak about those places that connect us, but also in a positive way, the kind of things that we have to offer the world as we move into and we understand the political climate and the machinations of tragedy that exist. I'm going to say once again, 1 in 4 humans as we speak are in a war zone, whatever that represents, whatever that means. And it's profoundly important that we know that just as well in war zones, subsequently, disproportionate number of Indigenous people in those jurisdictions suffer more like they do in other places. So one of the things that's also really important for us when we're talking about this is that peace and health also include addressing historical trauma, ensuring land rights and preserving cultural practices, and establishing, in many ways, re-establishing equitable social structures. So traditional social structures existed before. They existed with distortions within each place, and then part of the results of colonisation is the taking away, and now the adaptation again. So that includes sovereignty, and as we speak today, one of the challenges that affects the global north more than anybody else, they probably feel, is fossil fuel sovereignty. And so these are the things. So one of the places that we also acknowledge and represent in who and what we are is saying that health from a viewpoint of a holistic state is really around, as I've kind of alluded to, the constant notion of community, our relationships with each other, our relationships with others that share our space, relationship with in my case, in our native tongue, Papatūānuku, Mother Earth, and everything around that and what that represents. So we also know that various Indigenous groups have their own particular spaces and recognition that we share again. So our aim is to restore balance and healthy relationships within communities, shifting justice from, and here's the interesting space, from a retribution space. So we know that for many people who are Indigenous and incarcerated and the kind of situations that happen for them, what we do know that we share a space in Indigenous folk of moving away to social justice, that retribution is not about healing, and healing the collective well-being is therefore about health. So I might just also just acknowledge that the working group was established in after 2016. One of the things that happened about being the first Indigenous person on the governing council is we received a mandate from Melbourne, from the Public Health Congress there, from a yarning circle, support from Indigenous and non-Indigenous allies, and so I took to the Federation our move to create an Indigenous working group. Can I say, globally, in organisations not dissimilar to civil societies like this, it takes sometimes decades to get recognition and have that. And I want to acknowledge that the Federation, within basically 6 months of the mandate being given globally, recognised the working group. So there are a couple of things that we wanted to do. One of the things is to have the presence of at least having, in some space, giving recognition by having an Indigenous president of the society. And we've been able to achieve that. Having a place as a working group. We've been able to achieve that, and we have another plan, which I'll share a bit further on, or maybe the President might like to do that. So one of the things that's really important is that we're about addressing health disparities and inequities. So part of what we're doing is being present. And being present is not just about being present, but giving voice to a space that actually wasn't there. So if I'm going to acknowledge the Federation, and I want to acknowledge the Federation, I also want to acknowledge there was little, if any, recognition in its over half a century of the place and space of Indigenous folk. And so our presence there is important. Important to not just be reactive, but also to acknowledge that this is something which is new. Therefore, it's going to be scary. And so we've been able to be in the space for that. In saying that, I'm going to actually give a personal opinion around some of the conflicts that are going on. So it's important to acknowledge as an Indigenous person. I'm actually not going to talk about Gaza and Palestine. I'm going to talk at whatever name you give recognition to that piece of dirt, whether it's Canaan or otherwise, however historically long that place is. There are three significant of the five significant religions that exist in humanity. Three of them come from that place. As an Indigenous person, I can say, and I talk to a lot of our peoples, what's going on there gives no confidence, and we have to ask, what have we learned from you? Because these have also been important, in some cases, weapons and tools of colonisation. So what do we say in 2025, 2026 as Indigenous folk? What are you teaching us with all that's going on there? What are you teaching us in other places and hotspots around the world as you have your various crusades as Indigenous people? Nothing. Nothing really. And so we fall on those other things that we know collectively as members of humanity. And so, well, how about we lean into those wonderful things that we all connect with before the social structures and economic structures that exist today? That doesn't mean we believe in throwing, as the cliche goes, the baby out with the bathwater. We acknowledge the importance of this. We're not naive, but you need to really look at yourselves. Meanwhile, and I would say this to Geoffrey, I've been saying it to the various people, along with the 6 to 7 million people recognised in the United States that sit on a reservation. And meanwhile, we wait. We wait and we watch. We have no real influence in what's going on in these places. So we wait and we watch. And we're ready. And in fact, our place of falling to the ground is closer than it is for you. And my last point around this is, if there's a bonus around the lockdowns that happened with SARS-CoV-2, with COVID-19, there was a moment in the skies. And prior to that happening, at any one time, there were 5 million humans in the air, 7 million at any time in a 24-hour process. It stopped. And there was a moment that we stopped. There's a moment of collectiveness. Can I say I felt proud because it was the closest we came to being in our villages, wherever you were from. We had a place to just pause and breathe. And so that may not be the whole answer. We're not naive, but we know that some of the things that are going on need not happen. And so we just have to come back to those simple things. I might just stop there because I know that my wonderful colleagues have things to contribute, and I know that Emma will also be timing us for a few questions as we go through. Oh, and also want to acknowledge one of those groups that I was saying, I can see Nourish are here as well. And so this is another opportunity to acknowledge the connections and the links that we have across the globe. And if this is the conduit to these things, then so be it. So thank you, Emma, and thank you, everybody. Kia ora tātou.
Thank you, Adrian. that foundation that you've built for us around not only the importance of why organisations like the Federation need to understand Indigeneity and make space for them within them, or for us within them, but also that comprehensive geographical picture and historical picture that you have drawn for us around, again, why it's important to have Indigenous peoples in these spaces, at these tables, in these places. And I also, want to touch on a couple of things that you already have, which is, the notion of this work was significantly important to the Federation really understanding itself and its responsibilities and obligations to the whole population of the planet and the planet itself, and also how it can demonstrate actions. And so I think that often when we're in spaces, what we are trying to impart on people, or really have people understand, is what does it look like in action to not only acknowledge Indigenous communities and those communities most affected by that process that is colonisation. And you spelt that out really clearly, that this is not a conversation that is something that is talking about something that's done. It is continuing to happen, and we are seeing it, as you have just described, in the Middle East as a continuing process that Indigenous peoples are it's sort of what we call that divide and conquer thing that happens from the process of contemporary colonisation, that we continue to have difficulties between our nations as much as there are still the difficulties between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And why these conversations that we are having is so important is that the majority of the rest of the world that isn't us, and also parts of our own communities, are not having these conversations in order to undo those harms. And so for me, I'm really passionate and dedicated to that education that we can share with people about the truth of the historical context of where we come from as a whole population, as a global population, and the importance that all of this story tells in terms of how we're going to move forward and having peace and health and peace. And so I'm going to go to Geoffrey. And also want to acknowledge something that you touched on also, Adrian, that Geoffrey and Alejandro are both here representing the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, and Jessica here representing the Planetary Health Alliance. And this is this whole notion of how we are building movements. And you also acknowledged Nourish, which is the new initiative that's being built to support the decolonizing of workforces globally, particularly in public health, but beyond. That there is an intention and a strategy in the way in which we have chosen to work to ensure that we can increase and scale up the impact of these things that we believe in through these relationships. So relationships are a really, really key thing to addressing the issues around colonisation. And the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, I really want to recognise as the first all Indigenous organisation to become an associate member of the Federation. So as much as the Indigenous Working Group is foundational, I want to acknowledge that that is a really significant relationship for the Federation and for the Federation to celebrate. So I'm going to go, Geoffrey, to you, because you're a champion of systems change and how we need to see systems move and form differently, particularly at this global level. And speaking to you particularly in regards to your work at the United Nations Permanent Forum and through the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance with Alejandro, I was wondering if you could, talk to me a bit more about how you're seeing historical injustice and structural inequities continue to shape health. We can look at, particularly in places of conflict when thinking about the forum and the experiences of being a forum member, but also in that community, but also, more broadly. And Alejandro, please feel free to join in as well here. So over to you, Geoffrey.
Thank you. It won't be a surprise to any of us. I think everything you just said is kind of what I'm going to say too, and wanted to say. I think we're all on the same page, Adrian and Emma. It's like this is orchestrated. We, just like you just said, we continue to see these injustices and structural inequities shape our public health field today because of colonization and conflict. And these are not just past concepts, these are current concepts that are ongoing structural conditions. and they are built into our systems. I think that's very important to remember. These systems that have been created have built in colonization into them. And so there is a deprogramming that we need to see happening. It's a systems design issue. These aren't isolated problems that exist. Many institutions were created in ways that continue to disadvantage Indigenous peoples, especially through these things that we identify in the Indigenous Determinants of Health, including land disposition, exclusion from governance, and unequal control of resources. These are all colonial continuities. They still affect our health outcomes today as Indigenous peoples, and frankly, they affect everyone's health conditions in the world. And when we're talking specifically about conflict settings, it becomes even more dire or serious. Conflicts should be understood also as structural determinants of health, not just something that's temporary or an external factor. It disrupts core systems that communities rely on, again, like land, relationships, and food systems, and governance and cultural continuity. Because of this, the impacts are not short term. We see intergenerational inequities occur and intergenerational health problems persist across our generations in our Indigenous communities. Many global health approaches still treat these issues as background or context, not the crux of what we're discussing. I really think that these are some blind spots that we see in the public health system and the global public health system because they ignore these root causes. So if we're going to address these structural drivers, we need to keep reproducing. We cannot keep reproducing the same inequities, even under the new policies and programs. Even though we see new things, like right now at the WHA, we have an opportunity to create a global plan of action. But I'm seeing the same structures be reproduced that we've seen over the last 100 years of colonization. I told the speakers before we got on here, I got an email this morning that really is just replicating exactly what we've seen in the creation of this new global plan of action. It's very frustrating to see that. So if we use, though, an Indigenous health lens or an Indigenous determinants of health lens, we can better understand how some of these structural issues and how these conflict related dynamics are related. When you use this framework, the framework shows how land and governance and power all shape health across systems, and how Indigenous health reflects these broader system conditions. And it also highlights that Indigenous health is not just one part of a system, it acts as a system integrator because of its holistic nature, showing how all of these dynamics comes together and how it can shape the health outcomes, not just of Indigenous people, but of all people of the world. And I think that shows also how Indigenous peoples can play a leadership role to some of the greatest issues that we face now as a world.
Thanks, Geoffrey. I really like how you described Indigenous determinants as a system integrator. I hadn't heard that term before. I really like it. It makes total sense. Alejandro, do you have anything further you want to add on I guess it's what needs to continue to change in regards to, Geoffrey's comments around the system isn't built for the results that we need. So do you have any thoughts, comments you want to make in regards to that?
Yeah, just building up on what Jeff was saying about the conflict and how Indigenous people suffer and go through it. I think the same way that the system is designed to actually create this multifactorial kind of like, we're not able to see the whole picture because it is all fragmented. In times of peace, the solutions are also fragmented. The solutions that they are trying to provide are also fragmented, uncoordinated, they are not providing a holistic or intergenerational solutions. And so what we are trying to do with the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, with the platform that we have, is to provide that basis for the coordination and to avoid fragmentation of the solutions across the system. So I just want to mention that because, when we talk about conflict, we're talking about an exacerbated situation, but also in terms of peace, when the solutions are offered, they are offered usually from a very fragmented way. So I just wanted to say that.
Thank you, Alejandro. And I just wondered, maybe Geoffrey and/or Alejandro, did you want to talk a little bit about free, prior, and informed consent and the importance of people understanding this in these spaces, and how that plays into ensuring that, you've touched on it both really, I guess, but just for the listeners, could you give us a little bit around that?
Yeah, sure. So, there is this concept of free, prior, informed consent that's part of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And, I hate to be the Debbie Downer about everything, so I'll try and be more positive about it, but we don't see a really good adoption of FPIC across UN systems, let alone in member states. There's really a lot of uneven applying of this concept. We don't see institutions with real policy on how to create meaningful consultation in agency decision making. Quite often, we'll have lots of consultations, but then they don't necessarily make it into the decision-making process. We need to see big picture systems change here. And the real issue is not just about having the consultation and hearing what Indigenous people said. It's taking the input from Indigenous peoples and ensuring that it's actually implemented. It's hearing what Indigenous peoples have to say in these leadership arenas if we get to the table, and making sure that that becomes part of the decision-making process. This is what I'm talking about, these big systems issues that are baked into these systems and how they've been put together. Emma, I know, in the UN system, it's hard to even get a seat at the table when it has to do with member states or UN agencies or anything like that, let alone actually having anybody there listen to what you have to say and move forward with implementation of what we have to say. This matters most because we are rights holders as Indigenous peoples under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and treating us as stakeholders, as we often have. That's one of our biggest issues. We get treated as stakeholders rather than rights holders, creates real barriers to leadership. So I really feel that we have a lot of work to do when it comes to consultation and free, prior, informed consent. One of the other issues that we have with free, prior, informed consent is that if an institution doesn't like what I'm saying, they'll bring in another person and validate that person as an Indigenous person because they don't necessarily agree with what I'm saying. That's what's happening this morning, frankly, in some emails I've received from the WHO. And that is part of this fragmentation that we're talking about. By not respecting the institutions, like you said earlier, by not respecting the institutions that we have put together and that we collectively work to create, that is also a continuation of these structural problems and continuation of colonization today. That's how we see it today. If the individual that's in the institution, the bureaucrat in the institution, doesn't feel that it fits with what they want to do for Indigenous peoples, they move on to another organization or they invite another person that may or may not even have expertise in the system that they're looking to look at. One other just issue I want to bring up, and one of our members of the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance. By the way, we're a group of 50 Indigenous researchers and politicians and community leaders that are Indigenous from around the world. One is very interested in it, and I really want to continue exploring the idea of the need to continue to receive free, prior, informed consent, not just once, because I can't consent for my ancestors, and I can't consent for future generations of Indigenous peoples. I can consent now for today and how it affects me as an Indigenous person. So these mechanisms that we create in these institutions need to ensure that they have a continual feedback loop as time moves on and as new people come to the table.
Thank you, Geoffrey, and you touched on a few things in your comments, and one of the things that is in my mind is the word accountability. And Jessica, I'm going to come to you eventually, but I just want to talk about the notion of accountability, and also this. And I really like that you've touched on this thing around free, prior, informed consent and the ongoing need for that. And I think Adrian and I can both attest to, so we can talk about that as a thing that people do, and they think that once they've done it once, then it's complete and they've ticked that box. Well, that's the thing that's really wrong with the way that people see and understand how to practice in regards to Indigenous populations, and that it's actually not just that, but it's a shifting to a rebalancing of the distribution of decision making and where power is held. And unless we can shift the notion of how and who gets to be in the decision-making seats on a daily lived basis, then we are not going to see the continued recognition of that free, prior, and informed consent in a real, authentic way that's going to actually see the change that's required. And so it's the shifting of decision-making and power in the places. And so, on a smaller, and this is kind of taking me to what organisations can do in terms of recognising how they can behave differently, and that is thinking about the communities that all need to be represented in the context in which they're working. And I'm just going to touch briefly in my mind on Jessica and the relationship that we have with Jessica and the Planetary Health Alliance is understanding for the broader non-Indigenous community in public health, just to keep it narrow for me right now, is what does it look like to be a good ally to Indigenous communities as an organisation, and understanding how you change the way you make decisions and share power and resource as a non-Indigenous organisation to ensure that Indigenous voices are upheld the way that they should be. And I can say from my own perspective, when I first came across the Planetary Health Alliance some 10, 12 years ago, it was just really, it was almost like that was the beginning of the conversation around planetary health from a non-Indigenous perspective. The conversation and working with Indigenous peoples to understand what it looks like inside this organisation needed to look. And so Jessica, for me, as I say in lots of places, is a really good example of what it is to be in a decision-making place in an organisation that really supports wanting to know and understand Indigenous perspectives correctly, and then how to uphold those within an organisation like theirs. So what I'm going to do, Alejandra, I did see your hand up. Did you have something that you wanted to add before I go to Jessica and ask her some more questions?
Oh, it's okay. Just wanted to say that the free, prior, and informed consent, it is not well applied or consistently applied, but we can talk about it later. That's fine. Thank you.
Yes, very much. Thank you. Thank you. So Jessica, now I'm going to go to you, given what I've just sort of described around the relationship that we have and the things that I've noticed around where you sit in terms of your organisation, but you're also here as an expert in your own right. And I think what we're recognising in this conversation is that, there's a whole lot of an intersection between geopolitics, environmental change, and health right now. And I'm really interested in, where planetary health came from, and in terms of what its ultimate goal is. What are the things that we can learn from the thinking around that, what you have learned and know and understand about your relationship with myself and Geoffrey and Adrian and the others, that you can share in terms of this conversation around peace for health and health for peace. So over to you, Jessica.
And there's so much I want to say, both based on your question and what I've heard here. And as I stated to begin with, the concept of planetary health is just understanding that as we are, polluting our air and our water and contaminating our food, as the climate is changing, as we are losing biodiversity, we are also harming the health and well-being of humans and all life on this planet. And so there's a real concern that what used to be something that you could sort of think of as an earth crisis, or some people thought of as an earth crisis, is really a health and humanitarian crisis. And I think, and I'm going to circle back to what you were saying in a minute, I think there's also a story that we tell in the sort of that's baked into the development of the concept of planetary health, which really illustrates the points that you all have been making, is that the systems are built for the results we have, not the results that we need. And so what we have found is, if you look maybe 75 years ago, starting in that time period, we have what we sometimes call the Great Acceleration, where you just saw this huge explosion in terms of consumption of everything, not only water and energy and food, but telecommunications, paper. I mean, across the board, we just began to consume more and more as humans. And for a time, this led to some improvements in global public health outcomes. But what we've realized is now we're getting to a point where the harm that we've done to this planet is now harming our own health. And so basically, in the pursuit of some short-term developmental, goals, we've really mortgaged our future. And so what do we need to do to disrupt this pattern? And I think this is exactly the point. Part of what has happened in this time is we've really sort of severed that connection to nature that Adrian started talking about. And so that's why it's not only, do we want to be in conversation with Indigenous partners and leaders? We have to be listening to people and learning from people who have not had that rupture, who have understood and appreciated all throughout the fact that we need to be in balance. We as in the Western traditions and the global North traditions that have sort of led us to the consumption patterns that we see now, that have been so extractive, that have harmed the earth and ourselves, we need to have a real shift in that relationship. And that's why it is so important to be in discussion with as many different people around the globe as we can, and to really hear from perspectives from Indigenous peoples throughout the world, to think through how can we restore that balance in nature so that we can have a future in which we all thrive. So it's not just and I think this is part of the piece, and we're still learning as an organization. I can't say that we do this right all the time. It's not just about, there's a piece over here where we're engaging with Indigenous leaders. It really is sort of fundamental to the outlook on how do we get to the place that we all as a planet need to be on, and how do we sort of center those goals of having this future that we can thrive. And I noticed, Adrian, it was really interesting the way you talked about pieces, not just the absence of conflict. As I was thinking about today's session, I came across a quote from Martin Luther King Jr., who said that essentially the same thing, that peace is not the absence of tension, but it's the presence of justice. And so we need to have not only what are the things that we're trying to reduce in terms of the environmental harm, but what is our vision for the future? And so a couple more things that I just want to say to that. One, specific to today's theme about peace for health and health for peace, we really see environmental change as one of those key moderators in that circle. So we know that environmental harm is a huge cause of conflict. I've come to know someone who's earned the nickname unwittingly of the climate general, because he served in military capacities. And what he realized when he was on the ground in conflict zones is that so often the underlying cause, the true cause, was there was drought or famine. It led to dislocation. It led to conflict. And so if we want to reduce conflict, we need to address those underlying environmental harms. We also know that in addition for that thirst for water, there's a thirst for oil. There's a thirst for other, minerals and extractive substances. And we need to address those and curb those demands for those substances if we want to reduce conflict. And we also know, that conflict and war is a huge source of environmental harm. So not only is there tragic loss of life immediately, but it's also the devastating consequences for the earth and the years and years it will take to recover from the harm that is being done. We're currently working with colleagues in Japan to plan a convening there, and they know so well, so intimately, the harm and the exposure from nuclear war. But there are so many toxic exposures that we are inflicting upon people by having these conflicts. And so to me, to have this notion that, you know, we need peace for health and health for peace. And one of the reasons, one of sort of those connecting or moderating factors is what is the environmental piece in that, and how do we work to achieve, you know, broader health for both people and planet. And then the final thing that I'll say before turning this over is something that I heard, you know, as a story that I heard that really inspired me. We had a woman from Kenya talking about a group that she had started, and it was focused on this notion of how do we move from sort of those current extractive systems to where we want to be. And so she and her community actually started a program where they would take the sites of gold mining that had done terrible harm, and they reconsecrated them by having music and dance to say this is now a spot for community. And so I think that's where we need to be focusing on, is disrupting these systems that continue to produce the outcomes that we don't want, and thinking through what is the outcome that we do want: a place for community, a place for justice, a place where all have those opportunities so that we can create those together.
Thank you, Jessica. And you again have highlighted some things that I also want to sort of follow on with or contribute to. And this notion of tension, and I'm thinking about tension in terms of, you know, where does peace lie? And when we talk about peace, often most people jump to the notion of war and conflict. And so it goes also back to Adrian's original question. But in actual fact, you know, when we think about peace, do we think about internal peace? And when I think about internal peace, I think about internal peace as an Indigenous person who's often experiencing erasure and other, you know, practices that tell me that I don't exist, or that I have to explain my very existence. And that also goes to lack of access to culture, language, and those things, and how we very much need to, if we're thinking about, you know, rebalancing the way in which we practice as individuals, but also as organisations, that thinking about peace in terms of the individual internal peace and how we need to be part of making sure that the way that we behave is acknowledging and addressing the humanity of each of the people around us. And so I think that that's really important, particularly again in relation to the idea of tension, because I often find, and I'm just talking about in terms of public health practice and the achievement of the parts of work that need to happen differently in order to ensure everyone is acknowledged and gets what they need, where they need it, how they need it, when they need it. One of the biggest challenges that I see with people, with humans, is that when tension occurs, people want to run away from it. And in actual fact, when we're thinking about how we need to construct new ways of doing things, often there's tension in letting go of the old and creating the new. And so to each and every person out there, you know, what are you reflecting on in terms of how can you be able to be okay with the tension that's actually important in terms of establishing peace internally and externally? Because I think when we think about leadership, we think about accountability, this is one of the biggest challenges, is people get afraid and they run from the fear instead of going towards it, because what's on the other side is the thing that's actually going to help us to get what we need. Adrian, I saw your hand up. I'm going to hand it over to you, and then I'm going to do one more sort of reflective question for everyone to contribute before we close. Thank you.
Great. Hey, thank you. I've been trying to resist this. It's okay. Well, look, thank you, Jessica. Just a reminder. Look, I'm just going to touch on a couple of things, and it kind of lines up with the stuff that quite understandably Geoffrey was alluding to, and Jessica, you know, you're acknowledging with regards to planetary health. So some of you have heard me say this. So I come from a place that we call Te Moana Nui Akiwa. You know it as the Pacific Ocean. It's 1/3 of the surface of the planet. It's the biggest single organism. I don't care how big your forests are in other places. It's the largest single organism on this planet. It's the Pacific Ocean. And of course, it was given that wonderful Latin name, a place of peace. But actually, that's the barometer. It's the real barometer. So for those of us who've kept this place warm for millennia, we charge everyone around this Pacific Ocean that guards it from Tierra del Fuego all the way up and around to Turtle Line, all the way around and comes around to us again. And that's the barometer. And so one of the terms that we use traditionally is like a takiwa, our tribal area. And so that's the barometer as well. And I'm just going to kind of touch into the next thing around this, which kind of ties it up. You know, when we look at all the challenges that face Indigenous folk and we look at all the challenges that face humanity, and please apologise if it sounds like an increase in historical literacy, but the economics and everything about it, and it all sits on this ridiculously silly thing that somebody would be familiar with in terms of the chain of being. And so everything about what we're doing with regards to the degradation of humanity and the degradation of our planet is relative to this doctrine that God, whoever's God was, came out and said at the top of that picture is God, then angels, and then humans. They were white humans. Actually, they were men. They were nobles. They were commoners. Then after that, there were animals. Then after that, there were slaves. And then after that, there were plants. And at the bottom, there were minerals. So that's the order of importance that's existed since medieval times. And with the colonization of places in humanity and the era of people's various God-driven religions and so on. And when you come down to it, that's the order. So everything around the Strait of Hormuz is all around this chain of order. At the bottom is where we sit. Because the bottom thing was that you could turn your planet and just use it as a place to extract. And you could use certain people to extract that. So that's not an ancient story. It's a story that has this continuity in today. So if as an Indigenous person, I turn it up the other way, when I think about Geoffrey's Lakota people, and I think about Alejandro's people in Mesoamerica, when I think about all of our peoples, what we're talking about is understanding it for what it is, and that's what that is. And understanding recognition of what that is, and actually at the bottom of it sits the place that gives us sustenance. And if we don't move to that, and I'm not saying we should be doing anything more than understand that, but that's the foundation of everything economically, everything politically, everything in a religious way. It sits in an order like that. And so we're at the bottom. We're only ahead of the minerals and the plants which are being extracted and exploited every single day. So if we take those notions that we belong to, if we take those things of others that share this place with us in the periphery of our big organism, which is 1/3 of the planet, the Pacific Ocean, we are not the owners, we're the guardians. There's your barometer. That's your tipping point. So when I say that, so at the moment, my last thing around this, there are people that are worried that we're at a tipping point in humanity, that this will go to World War III. Well, our people are not worried about that. The planet will take itself back. And we as an organism will just be what that is. But what we offer as a group of Indigenous people, what we offer is people that sing the same song as everybody else. It's just 3 or 4 generations ago. And you alluded to it, Jessica. In humanity, we didn't do much for the first 10,000 years until we kind of jumped in the last 200 years. And then we've done this thing. So, part of those things around the gift that we give to fellow humans is not about about being Indigenous only. It's about being closer to that space and understanding it for what it is. So when we think about people in poverty, deprivation across the planet, they're not panicking like those of us in the global north are, because they're closer to that place anyway. So this is the gift that we have to share around. It's not a negative thing. It's about the reality of what it is. So this is part of the role of this simple organisation as an Indigenous working group in a civil society that has a measure of influence. So we stick to that line, we run down those things, and part of that is all the places of humanity and all the things in institutional sclerosis that's got in the way in that process of war. So my apologies if it sounds like a tirade or a rant. It's the song that all of our people in our nations have been singing and still continue to sing. It's not about Indigenous people only. We all understand this for what it is. Okay.
Thank you, Adrian. And actually, what you've done quite beautifully is bring it to the place where I wanted to bring us to sort of tie us up and I guess leave our participants with, even more of that sort of deep respect of the richness of what it is to be Indigenous and, touching on the importance of Indigenous perspectives around how we think about security and peace, but not only that in terms of accountability and who we are on the planet. And one of the things that you and I speak of often is, and you've alluded to it in what you've just talked about, which is, and I will bring it into the rest of you. When we introduce ourselves to people in our traditional fashion, we always introduce our name last. So we talk about our mountains, our rivers, our seas, the place, the land that we come from, and then we give our name last. And that's to situate ourselves, just as you described, Adrian, very beautifully, as the least important part of the picture. That doesn't make us not important, but it means that we understand that the greater picture is something that we are only a player in. And so and when you're talking, Adrian, and I always see these circles or spirals, the spiral that goes in to the point in the middle and then the point in the middle that comes out, which when I'm describing that in my mind, it makes sense to me because it's such an Indigenous way of seeing things in terms of the central point infusing itself into the greater whole and then back down again into that central point, being the person. And so I really just want to invite each of you, and I'll start with Jessica, just to, I guess to leave the conversation with, some reflections around, you talked a lot, Jessica, around the need, how we need to shift things in order to see change actually occur. So if you had any sort of final thoughts about this conversation or words that you want to leave with people about how they can choose to be differently in order to see those changes that we need. I'm going to hand it to you, and then I'll go to Alejandro, then I'll go to Geoffrey, and then Adrian, I'll give you 1 more minute at the end, and then I'll wrap us up. All right, Jessica, over to you. Any final thoughts, basically? Thank you.
Yeah, and I want to touch on what you said about tension and that the fear and the running away. And I think the thing that I would say is the final thought is that we have to realize that doing nothing is also a choice. And so I think it's too easy to fall into the there's nothing that can be done. We're just going to continue to let things go as they are. And that is an action. And so I think the thought I would leave us with is we need to sort of disrupt that and realize that just continuing as we are is making a decision and is making a decision that will not lead us to where we want to go, which is that future in which we can collectively have opportunities to flourish. Thank you.
Thank you, Jessica. Alejandro, to you.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So I actually would like to build on what Adrian was talking about, Indigenous peoples being the barometer, because that is what our latest study is going to be about, how Indigenous peoples are a health outcomes indicator for the system, as well as a solution as a systems integrator. So I just really appreciate what you mentioned, Adrian, and I think that's the way it is. So I just want to say that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alejandro. And would you like to give the listeners the website address so that people can go and look for those reports of which you speak?
Yes, definitely. It's www.indigenousdha.org altogether, and there you guys can find it.
Thank you very much. That's excellent. And Geoffrey, to you.
Sorry. I really want to talk a little bit more about the Indigenous determinants of health. That's what I do. I think we still think of health too narrowly. And that's one of our biggest issues. I think you're hearing that from everybody here, from on the panel. We treat it as an access issue, or to hospitals or to clinics, or we look at clinical indicators quite often. I work, pretty intensely in the health and medical field, and that's all we ever talk about. It's really more difficult to think about, well, how does fishing in our community really affect the health of our elders, and how do we have that conversation? How do we think about it? How do we ensure that it's getting evaluated? And how do we make sure that we're approaching it appropriately for our Indigenous peoples? So, we have this concept that Indigenous is a much broader issue, and it's more about relationships with the environment and with the land and with our cultural ways of life. So, often the most important determinants are land and governance and cultural continuity and language and knowledge systems, traditional knowledge systems. And these are not just secondary issues to health. Indigenous health is holistic and it's interconnected, and it reflects how different systems, whether they're social or environmental or political, how they're all working together. But when we have these mainstream institutions or frameworks that continue to exist that we've talked about today, these colonial systems, they only focus on the systems and not the structural causes. And this mismatch really leads to problems with ineffective policy development, misaligned interventions for our communities, and frankly, the population as a whole, and solutions that don't actually improve health outcomes. And this is why we need a new approach. We need a reframing of health through an Indigenous people's lens. The IDHA framework, or the Indigenous Determinants of Health framework, does this by identifying 33 protective and risk factors that are specific to Indigenous peoples, by showing how health is shaped across systems, not in isolation, by providing guidance for institutions to align with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and also providing cultural safety for Indigenous peoples, and by also offering, I think this is one of the most important things, an evaluation tool to measure performance and ensure accountability through our institutions to make sure this happens. Indigenous determinants of health are being missed because public health systems are not designed to see them. This framework, the IDHA framework, helps to make these determinants visible, measurable, and actionable so health systems can finally address the root causes, not just the symptoms. So again, our call to action is to have these institutions adopt and implement an Indigenous Determinants of Health framework across global systems, that's UN systems and member state systems, embedding Indigenous governments into decision-making authority, ensuring that institutions listen to and act on recommendations that come from Indigenous peoples, aligning institutional structures with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and implementing measurement and accountability systems that are meaningful to Indigenous people's health. Thanks.
Woohoo.
Yeah, thank you, Geoffrey, for that. I also want to double down on that in another way, because being the current president of the World Federation of Public Health Associations, it never ceases to amaze me how much our broader public health community still focuses on a very medicalized version of public health. And as far as I'm concerned, public health has always been around addressing the social and economic determinants of health. So as has been touched on already today, I think as Sir Michael Marmot said, the cause of the cause of the cause, to quote a white person, which is what we're really talking about, is how did we get where we've got, and how do we undo what we have in order to go forward? We have to understand the cause of the cause of the cause. We need to address the social and economic determinants of health. And actually, what we really need to be doing is understanding the Indigenous determinants of health and implementing those everywhere, because that encompasses all of the things that the non-Indigenous world describes as the social determinants of health, with an Indigenous lens and understanding of the richness of what it means to live as a collective society founded on spirituality and other really important cultural norms. And so really just doubling down on that, Geoffrey, that to understand the Indigenous determinants of health, to implement these things within our systems, is to decolonize our systems, and to understand, respect and acknowledge indigeneity as one of the central most important things in terms of behaving in a real human way so that everyone can succeed. Adrian, I'm going to give it back to you and then I'll wrap us up. Thank you.
Thank you for my 90 seconds. Look, my Indigenous lens says peace for health and health for peace embodies a holistic and interconnected understanding of well-being, where peace is fundamental. Peace is fundamental to health, and health in turn sustains peace. Where there's conflict, there's a place of unhealthiness going on. And I love it, Geoffrey, when you describe what I describe as institutional sclerosis and all those things that kind of stop the stuff going on. And I think it's really important that we're really clear and understanding. Everyone knows there's one of our leaders here said years ago, he said, in terms of Indigenous sovereignty, the best way to promote that is to make like you never lost your sovereignty. And so I'm just going to touch on something that some of you have heard. If people like Emma and I, as just another group of Indigenous people from Aotearoa, if we look like uppity Indigenous people with a sense of entitlement, it's because we are uppity Indigenous people with the same entitlement as our fellow people, other people in humanity. And we're not just about being unapologetic, that we're able to acknowledge the place of all of us in the space, also who's got the power and where it's not being given, and that we just keep, and we're there, we're constant, and we never give up in that space. And then that common sense, because it resonates with everybody, because you only lost it 2 generations ago. So thank you, Emma. Thank you all. Wonderful to see you all.
Thank you, Adrian. And just to wrap us up, I want to touch on a couple of things. I feel like this is, I mean, as is with everything we do, there is so much more we could be doing. And this feels like we've only just started a conversation. And so I'm really looking forward to continuing these types of conversations with all of you and with some of our other friends. These are significantly important conversations for our broader public health community and our communities at large. And so it's a real honour to be a part of this group of people and to be able to contribute in this way to some longer lasting resource that people can easily access. But also saying that, Alejandro's given the website for the Indigenous Determinants of Health Alliance, where our communities can go and find some more information on this thing that we're talking about called Indigenous Determinants of Health, and some of the frameworks and the evaluation tool that have been developed by that broader group of 50 people that Geoffrey mentioned earlier. And that these are some really significant tools that are available to people that have not been available in such a way before. And that we are also consistently and currently developing more tools for people to access ways of educating and understanding what we are talking about and what is being talked about more broadly in terms of indigeneity and ways to rebalancing society. We're going through a process of developing some work on decolonizing governance in an NGO and civil society like the World Federation, and much more. And so we look forward to sharing more with you as we go along. But I really want to leave with this. And for me, it's essentially important that, this group of people here that's come together to speak about this, it's not really by happenstance. And we certainly haven't stayed together by not actively being in relationship with one another. We have chosen to be in relationship with one another, and I want to touch on that a lot because Geoffrey's spoken about it, Adrian's alluded to it, Jessica's talked about it, so has Alejandro when we're talking about, the things that we need to respect. Relationship is the most important thing that we can do as a public health community, be in relationship with one another. And often that can be really difficult because the world puts all these pressures on us to behave and think in different in ways that don't actually fit with being good humans. So I am going to put my call to action as be a good human. It's okay to display love. It's okay to be kind. It's okay to be nice. And it's also okay to have emotions. Too often our public health community does not allow itself to display its humanity, and I believe that is what's missing. So this conversation has been really about how do we behave towards one another in order to get that peace for health and health for peace. So thank you very much, everybody on the call. Thank you for joining me in this conversation. I'm looking forward to having another one, and thank you to everybody who's joined us today. So Adrian. Adrian wants to finish. I'm going to hand it over to Adrian so he can close our hui as the chair of the Indigenous Working Group of the World Federation, as is right, and as he can show it through our protocol. So, Adrian, over to you.
Just like to share some thoughts and feelings in our native language. Nō reira, I tuake ki te mihi o te kia koutou, o ka rangatira. Nō reira, nā maunga whakarakataka tū hono mai koutou. Tā tūpuna tū tunu ki te taha uru o te wakatapu, ei toka ahuru, ei toka marino, whakakapoa mai e koutou o koutou koroe hoka tio hauhu. A tihau Māori ora. Well wishes and much time and love to all of you. Thank you for the space. Thank you, Emma.
Tēnā koe, Adrian. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Go well. Thank you, Matthew.